And now we come to ourselves, modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, people capable of profound intellectual reasoning, of sophisticated communication, the communication not only of facts, but of thoughts and concepts and ideas. People capable of emotion, of loving, of hating, of laughing, of frowning. Ourselves in all our bewildering and fascinating diversity. And in this lecture, we're going to face a second question of questions in the human past. Where, when, and how did anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, first evolve? We're going to begin by describing three major grades of archaic forms of Homo sapiens which flourished in tropical Africa between 200 and 100,000 years ago. So the outer chronological limit of this lecture is about a couple of 100,000 years in the past. Then we're going to compare two competing hypotheses which try and account for the origins of modern humans: the multi-regional and the out-of-Africa hypotheses. Next, we're going to describe and discuss the compelling evidence from molecular biology, especially mitochondrial DNA, which strongly suggests that Homo sapiens sapiens evolved in tropical Africa. And finally, we're going to survey the ecological background to this development and the very limited archaeological evidence for the appearance of new hunting kits south of the Sahara about 100,000 years ago or earlier. So the chronological span of this lecture is from about 200,000 years ago to around 70,000 years or earlier. You'll recall that back in Lecture 2, I remarked that Charles Darwin himself expressed a belief that Africa was the cradle of humankind. He did so on the basis of the high number of apes in that continent, and he had stressed through his theory of evolution and natural selection the close anatomical relationships between humans and apes. This, of course, horrified the Victorians, who did not want to be thought of as having been descended from apes. And, as we've seen, Charles Darwin was correct. Africa was the cradle of humankind. But an increasing body of new information, especially cutting-edge genetic research, has shown that the same continent was probably also the cradle of modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, as well. Now this is a remarkable about-face, because for years archaeologists considered tropical Africa a cultural backwater. Its moment in the spotlight of human prehistory, they said, was with the origins of humans. It was the cradle of humankind. But after that, tropical Africa quietly vegetated, isolated from the rest of the world by the vast spaces of the Sahara. You can hardly blame them for this point of view, not because of racism or anything like that, but simply because of the lack of evidence. There were only a handful of archaeologists throughout tropical Africa. When I first worked there in the early 1960s, there were about 12. Thousands of square miles. Between them, over many years, they found a handful of archaic-looking human skulls and thousands of crude stone artifacts. Fortunately, new fossil discoveries, as well as molecular biology, have painted a very different picture of later human evolution south of the Sahara. Africa was a crucible of human evolution and a crucible of innovation for thousands of years. What then do we know about this very ancient Africa? Even today, I should warn you, we have but the thinnest patchwork of human fossils and important sites. The distances are enormous, the archaeological record is rich, but has hardly been scratched. You see, archaeologists are human. They prefer to work in the more spectacular areas. Central America, Europe, Southwest Asia, North America, where there are spectacular finds. The archaeological record of the origins of humans is, to put it mildly, unspectacular. But it is of crucial importance to our understanding of ourselves. After over a century of work, we know that at least 3 grades of archaic-looking Homo sapiens flourished in Africa, just as archaic Homo sapiens had evolved in Europe. These archaic Homo sapiens populations had evolved ultimately from Homo erectus and Homo ergaster, as we saw in Lecture 3. All had larger skull vaults and many other anatomical features like those of modern humans. In particular, their limbs were modern-looking, their skulls were more rounded, and many of the more extreme features of Homo erectus were reduced as brain size increased. The details of this anatomy are the domains of specialists. All I can do here is very briefly summarize what we know at the moment. Once again, I'm going to use some labels. You'll find them defined in the course guide. An early archaic Homo sapiens, and I mean early, was widespread from southern to northeast Africa about 200,000 years ago. We know almost nothing about these people, except the few fossils we do have are heavily built, thick skulls with massive brow ridges and other anatomical features which are much closer to those of Homo erectus than other skulls. Clearly, their ancestry is among very ancient humans in Africa. We talked earlier about the difference between a linear scheme of human evolution and the more bushing one. I think here particularly you must think again of the bush, of many different varieties of humans south of the Sahara. And one of these varieties, early archaic Homo sapiens, were heavily built, quite ancient-looking humans. Then there's another group, late archaic Homo sapiens, as opposed to early. Now here, the picture gets very much more complex. You're looking at a mosaic, and the word mosaic is a good word, of different features found on the surviving skulls. Some of the features, like brow ridges, are ancient. They recall the early Homo sapiens and other archaic forms. Others, on the other hand, more rounded skulls, modern-looking limbs, tend to favor a more modern grade of human, with the modern features tending to outnumber the ancient ones. You're talking about a very scattered, isolated African population, numbering in a few thousands, small bands, many of them living in extreme isolation, so the evolutionary pressures on them were the result very often of isolation. Now these more modern-looking creatures tend to date to around 100,000 years ago or somewhat earlier. So they're a little later than the early archaic ones. Then there's a third group, and this group is anatomically modern. Only a very few archaic features. Their heads and skulls are rounded, brow ridges reduced, faces look modern, and there are only a few archaic features which vary from one specimen to the other. Remember that all these portraits are drawn of so few specimens that the whole picture may change within a generation. Our research on this is only just beginning. Africa is one of the hardest places to do fieldwork in the world because of the conditions out in the bush and the logistics. So it's hardly surprising that research tends to move slower here than it does in other parts of the world. But at this early point in research, we do know that these modern-looking humans were widely distributed in eastern and southern Africa as early as 115,000 years ago, maybe earlier. Very complex evolutionary picture. Some populations probably preserved archaic features and behavior longer than others. Modern humans' features probably developed in a few populations, maybe widely separated ones. The same evolutionary pressures may have occurred in different parts of Africa. We don't really know. But we do know, from the very limited fossil evidence, that the evolutionary developments which led to Homo sapiens sapiens had run their full course in Africa by about 100,000 to 70,000 years ago in East and Southern Africa, far earlier than in Europe or Asia. You're looking at a period of time when the Neanderthals flourished in Europe and Southwest Asia. And the changeover in Africa seems to have been a rapid one in evolutionary terms. It took maybe 100,000 years, far shorter than the period, say, between Homo erectus and that with archaic Homo sapiens. Same old thing, a long period of stability and then sudden change. Period of stability, sudden change. So such fossil evidence we have, coming from archaeologically one of the least known areas of the world, points to Africa as the cradle of modern humanity. Or does it? Intense controversy surrounds this hypothesis. I would say that looking at prehistory as a whole, there are four great controversies. The first one is the origins of humans. The second one is the origins of modern humans. The third one is the peopling of the Americas. And the fourth one is the origins of agriculture. There were many others, but those are the big ones, and this is one of the big ones. Why? Psychologically, probably because everybody wants to find the first. But in practice, it is a lot of this sterile arguments about minor features of a handful of highly fragmentary fossils. The problem is that we're trying to reconstruct very, very complex evolutionary processes from teeny fragments of an enormous jigsaw. And the discussion goes on and on and on, but the fossil discoveries are few and far between. But to boil a very complicated controversy down to the simplest terms, the arguments over the modern humans pit two schools of thought, one against the other. There were those who believe that modern humans evolved in Africa and spread from there all over the globe. This is the majority viewpoint. Then there's the minority viewpoint, a group of scholars who argue that modern humans evolved independently and more or less simultaneously in different parts of the world. This is a multi-regional hypothesis as opposed to an out-of-Africa hypothesis. Those who argue for the multi-regional hypothesis claim that there is fossil evidence for evolutionary change in the direction of modern humans, both in Europe and in East Asia. In other words, that modern humans evolved more or less simultaneously in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, and elsewhere. They argue, for example, that in Asia, Homo erectus developed ever more modern anatomical features through the millennia until some population evolved into modern humans. They also believe that Homo sapiens sapiens evolved from Neanderthal populations in the West, despite DNA evidence which suggests that the Neanderthals were too fundamentally different to interbreed with modern humans. The multi-regional hypothesis is based almost entirely on fragmentary human remains, on this incomplete jigsaw we were talking about. The fossil evidence, actually, incomplete as it is, does not tend to support the multi-regional hypothesis. Furthermore, as I just said, and this is a very fundamental point, DNA extracted from a Neanderthal limb bone in Germany shows that there was complete incompatibility in terms of DNA from those archaic Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, with modern humans, to the point that they couldn't interbreed. And if this applies to the Neanderthals, it probably applies to other areas as well. And it seems increasingly likely that modern humans evolved in one area, and that area is Africa. I say this with some confidence because there is a new tool that has been applied to the origins of humans which has given us a startling new perspective on this whole problem. And that is molecular biology. This new approach has played a decisive role in the debate, to the point that most scholars now believe that modern humans did indeed evolve in Africa. The basis for this is mitochondrial DNA. Now, this particular form of DNA is inherited only through the maternal line. It is female DNA. It does not mix with or become diluted by paternal DNA. This means that you've got a sort of chain of a potentially reliable link between modern and ancestral populations. This approach, which was refined in the 1980s, has involved mitochondrial DNA analysis of women from all the continents, not just Africans, Europeans, Asians, Pacific Islanders. And it shows that the differences between all these women are very small, which suggests, and this is the fundamental point, that they split off from one another relatively recently. However, and this is where the fun really starts, the Africans in this sample displayed enough differences from the others to suggest that they were much earlier. It suggests that the Africans developed from diverse forms of mitochondrial DNA, more diverse forms than other present-day populations elsewhere in the world. How did this happen? Because they had more time to develop such mutations. When they discovered this, the scientists were excited, carried out further research, and developed an even larger database of nuclear DNA and of blood groups and enzymes. And together these databases display a primary split between Africans and non-Africans. Then later, a split between Eurasians and Southwest Asians. This data implies an early split in Africa, a dispersal of population from Africa, and then another split or bifurcation in Asia. This is a very complex debate. The chronology of it is subject to considerable argument. The methods are being continually refined. But enough research has been done to strongly hint that modern humans evolved in Africa, and that the ancestral Homo sapiens populations may have lived in Africa between 200 and 100,000 years ago. Now, when this discovery was first announced, there was a great deal of excitement and loose discussion about an African Eve from a Garden of Eden in Africa, a female, a primordial female, who was the first modern human. This, of course, is nonsense, because geneticists look at populations, not individuals. We can say at this point with some confidence that the weight of the genetic evidence and of the archaeological evidence favors the out of Africa hypothesis. But many details of the data of this whole process remain highly controversial, and it will be a while before new methodologies enable us to refine this. In particular, the date of the ancestral populations is highly uncertain. A biological anthropologist, Robert Foley, has argued that modern humans most likely evolved at a single location. He argues, too, that at about 100,000 years ago, or a little earlier, the African savanna, the crucible of the very first humans, would also have been an ideal environment for promoting the speciation of modern humans. He believes, and I agree with him, that modern humans evolved in a mosaic of changing tropical environments, and there they developed distinctive characteristics. Remember, these were isolated peoples, but peoples who had a wide-ranging behavior. In general terms and theoretical terms, we can say some things about these people. In response to this very mosaic-like environment, some groups may have developed very wide-ranging behavior. They were highly mobile. The food was in patches across a huge landscape. They may have lived in larger social groups, and they may have been highly selective in their diet. And this behavior, in turn, may have led to other changes. I don't think there's much doubt now that modern humans evolved in Africa. But what is the most striking difference between archaic and modern humans? It isn't our anatomy, although clearly there are differences. It is up here. It is our cognitive ability, our ability to plan, our ability to organize, our ability to reason logically, our ability to think and to conceptualize things theoretically. This is the big difference, because this impacts on every aspect of human existence. Hunting, plant gathering, loving, having children, bringing them up. Your views of the world, your world view, which is something we'll talk about a lot later in the course, and in our relationships with others, to say nothing of more efficient technology. And the real issue with the origins of humans isn't when the skeletal human being appeared, the anatomical, it's when everything cognitive really started to resonate. Because as we'll see when we move to the great diaspora of modern humans, it was this behavior which enabled people to adapt to an extraordinary range of environments, in short, to all extremes of environment in the world. This, too, may have evolved in Africa. So in a way, we've got to separate the person from the mind. In this mosaic of environments in tropical Africa, some groups probably developed more efficient technology, more specialized technology than the rather simple technology of the day, which reminds us rather of Neanderthal technology, which is hardly surprising because these were archaic human beings. They may have lived in larger groups, which gave them the ability to plan hunting more efficiently, to say nothing of scheduling, collecting of plant foods by moving to the right groves of nuts at the right season, for example, and also simply have planned their lives better. By doing this, they would have reduced the unpredictability of the environment in dramatic ways. One of the most striking things about modern humans is our ability to overcome the unpredictability, say, of climate change, to work around the limitations given us by a drought, and so on. What really happened in the long term, probably, was a very fundamental change in the way in which people went around gathering food, whether it was hunting or plant foods. The skills, the cognitive reasoning, the improved technology may have turned humans from mere scavengers and, albeit skilled, opportunistic hunters into super predators that could hunt almost any animal on Earth and could also settle in almost any extreme of environment as well. And as we will see in the next lecture, when humans spread, they spread to every environment in the world, and the only one they did not conquer initially were the offshore Pacific Islands, because that required the development of deep water canoes, the development of foods which could be stored, and long-distance open water navigational skills. When then did these critical technological and cognitive changes take place? We don't know exactly, but a handful of archaeological sites in Africa show that there were improvements in human technology at about the same time as modern humans appeared. Acheulean hand axes by this time were out of date. They'd given way to more sophisticated and versatile toolkits based on the making of flakes, just like you saw with the Neanderthals. This technology had appeared between 200 and 100,000 years ago. A couple of sites in South Africa document the changes. The Classis River Cave in extreme southeastern Africa lies a short distance from the Indian Ocean and was occupied between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, this critical time period. The occupation levels of the cave include some fragmentary human remains, among them the bones of anatomically modern people. And then, about 70,000 years ago, the inhabitants of the cave suddenly started making small thin flakes struck from these cores, and blades, long parallel-sided flakes, from fine-grained rock carried in from over 12 miles away. Some of the blades became spear barbs, others became knives. The toolkit was much smaller, lighter, and more versatile than the flake tools found in earlier layers. So there was a change, and another South African archaeologist, Hilary Deacon, believes that the new toolkit coincided with deteriorating conditions, climatic conditions, during the last cold snap of the Ice Age, which began about 100,000 years ago. Conditions were drier and cooler in southern Africa, the hunt more challenging for those with older, heavier weapons. When conditions became wetter and warmer, the old tools reappeared. In other words, people were experimenting with different toolkits. They were using their brains. Perhaps Classis River and other South African sites are evidence for a new flexibility in human behavior, an ability to adapt to changing circumstances at a level impossible for the Neanderthals and archaic Homo sapiens. It is a fascinating problem, and a problem which will be the starting point for our next lecture, which the fundamental question is, when did people spread out of Africa? When did these modern humans look at the wider world? Here we've merely laid the foundations. We've looked at how the origins of Homo sapiens sapiens are still largely a matter of speculation. But we've argued that the weight of the evidence strongly suggests that modern humans evolved in sub-Saharan Africa over 100,000 years ago. We've looked at some of the anatomical features. We've looked at a technology, but above all, what we have stressed is cognitive ability, this dramatic change in the ability of humans to reason, to plan, and to innovate, and to adapt. Because this is the big issue when we describe, as we will in the next lecture, the spread of modern humans across the Sahara Desert and into the rest of the world, one of the great diasporas of human prehistory.